welcome to American Catholic History. If you like our podcast, be sure to rate us and give us a review wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Today we're talking about the North American Martyrs, specifically the three who were martyred in what is today New York State, Saints Rene Goupil, Isaac Jogues, and John de Lalande.
Right. The larger group, known as the North American Martyrs, also includes 5 others who were martyred in present-day Canada. And while the group of 8 were canonized together in 1930 and are celebrated together on October 19th, we can't cover all 8 in one episode, so we are going to focus on the 3 who were killed within present-day United States.
2 other notes before we talk about our heroes. First, this group of 8 martyrs is called the North American Martyrs here in the United States, but in Canada they're called the Canadian Martyrs. That may be because all 8 were based in Canada, so they feel special ownership of all 8. I don't know. Should ask my Canadian friends.
No, really.
But for our Canadian listeners, when we talk about the North American Martyrs, we're talking about the Canadian Martyrs to you.
Yes.
Yep.
The other point is that, contrary to common knowledge, they were not the first men to shed their blood for Christ in North America. As we discuss in another episode, a Franciscan priest named Juan de Padilla was martyred 100 years earlier than these Jesuits, and his martyrdom happened somewhere in modern-day Kansas, less than 100 miles from the geographic center point of the continental United States.
That's not to take anything away from these 8 men. Their witness and sacrifice is every bit as remarkable and inspiring as anything the church has to offer. They weren't the first to shed their blood for Christ in North America, even if most of the literature credits them as such. So, with that caveat stated, let's talk about our 3 main subjects: St. Isaac Jogues, who was a Jesuit priest; St. Rene Goupil, a lay brother who had taken Jesuit vows before his death; and St. John de Lalande, who also was a lay brother and not in any vows.
Right, so the story takes us back to 16th and 17th century Canada. The French had first arrived in modern-day Canada in 1534 and had been working to establish permanent settlements along the St. Lawrence River and to the north of the Great Lakes. The situation they were sailing into included the Huron and Algonquin, who were more or less peaceful people and welcoming to outsiders. But then there was also the Iroquois nation, which controlled the land to the south of the Great Lakes. The various peoples of the Iroquois nation were not as peaceable. The French settled along the north bank of the St. Lawrence, and they forged alliances with the Algonquin and the Huron. They established what is now Quebec City on the St. Lawrence River in 1608 as a fur trading post.
Among the Frenchmen who came over from the earliest days were Jesuit missionaries. Colonization of the New World certainly had its political and economic motives, but the Catholic kings of Europe also saw their role as one of evangelization, so they provided for missionaries to make the trip to bring the light of Christ to the unevangelized land.
The missionaries established their bases in the major settlements, Quebec, Trois-Rivières, and Montreal, but forays went west deep into pagan territory. On the shores of Lake Huron, some 500 miles west of Quebec City, the Jesuits established a village which they named St. Joseph. The superior of the Jesuits in Canada at the time was Father John de Brebeuf, and he was located at St. Joseph.
John de Brebeuf is not one of the 3 we're focusing on, but he himself was eventually martyred in Canada about 6 years after our main heroes. He is another of the 8 North American martyrs.
But as superior, he was responsible for inspiring a number of the other missionaries to come to the New World. In 1636, John de Brebeuf was in France to recruit missionaries. Among the audience hearing his harrowing accounts of the hardships and dangers of life as a missionary was the newly ordained Father Isaac Jogues. Jogues' heart was set on fire for the mission. Jogues, 29 years old at this point, joined de Brebeuf on the return trip to New France in August of that year, arriving in time to celebrate the Feast of the Visitation, which was celebrated on July 2nd until 1969.
Isaac Jogues joined John de Brebeuf at the village of St. Joseph and poured himself into the work among the natives, learning their language, working with them, learning their customs, and sharing with them the good news of the gospel. But before he could really get into this work, he had to overcome a major obstacle, an obstacle that would, in a way, lead to his death.
Yes, disease. Shortly after he arrived, he became ill with the flu, and others in the village, both Jesuits and natives, also became ill. The Jesuits all recovered. It was, after all, a disease that their European bodies were accustomed to, but a number of the natives died.
Since medical science didn't yet understand viruses and diseases very well, the natives took it to mean that the Jesuits, or black robes as they called them, had brought this calamity, and they were doing it intentionally to some degree. This caused some strains in the relationship, but not enough ultimately for the Jesuits to lose the trust of the natives.
Jogues lived and worked and ministered and prayed and offered Mass, heard confessions, baptized and anointed the sick at St. Joseph for 6 years. It was in 1642 that the first part of his passion took place.
But before we get to the particulars of his suffering, we need to bring in the second name among our three martyrs, Rene Goupil.
Yes, Goupil was born the same year as Jogues, 1607, and he had come to the New World in 1640 as a donné. He was a physician by training and had been in the Jesuit novitiate back in France, but had to leave the novitiate within a year due to deafness. So he offered himself as a donné, or a layman who has given himself to the work of the mission, but who is not in religious vows. It was in this capacity that he had been working in hospitals in and near Quebec when he met Jogues in 1642. Jogues had returned to Quebec City in mid-1642 to collect needed medical and other supplies, and Goupil hooked on with Jogues as a disciple and a companion. He resolved to return to St. Joseph with Jogues.
In September of 1642, Jogues and Goupil, among others, set off to head back to St. Joseph. They made it about 3/4 of the way back to the area of Lake St. Peter, Ontario, when they were ambushed by a war party of Mohawks. The Mohawks were a people of the Iroquois Nation based along the Mohawk River, which flows from west to east in the middle of modern-day New York State.
The captured Huron and French travelers were stripped and beaten and taken from village to village to be displayed, beaten more, and humiliated. They endured this, marching with the war party 250 miles overland to the Mohawk village of Ossernenon, which was about 30 or 40 miles west of present-day Albany, New York. They arrived in Ossernenon well-bloodied, with broken bones, open wounds, and sores. Along the way, the Mohawk pulled out their fingernails, ordered an Algonquin woman to cut off at least one of Jogues' thumbs, and Mohawk warriors had gnawed through a few of Jogues' fingers, right down to the bone.
But also along the way, Rene Goupil had asked Father Jogues if he could make his vow as a Jesuit, since only health had prevented this before. In the present circumstances, such a concern didn't seem that significant. Jogues consented and received Goupil's vows as a lay Jesuit brother.
In Ossernenon, the first sacrifice would be made. The war parties who had brought the captives back had proven impervious to attempts to evangelize, but that didn't dampen the spirit of evangelization. In Ossernenon, Rene Goupil took the opportunities he had to teach some of the children the sign of the cross. He was caught in the act and cut down with the tomahawk. Father Jogues had an opportunity to grant him absolution and hear him die saying the holy name of Jesus. Rene Goupil became the first of the North American martyrs to win that crown on September 19th, 1642.
Father Jogues was kept alive and pressed into a state of service to an older Mohawk woman. It seems she actually saved his life more than once, as some of the younger braves wanted him dead. She took to calling him nephew, and he in turn called her aunt. He remained a prisoner of the Mohawk until June of the following year, when he managed to escape with the help of some Dutch traders.
Mind you, just as the Huron and Iroquois were enemies, so were the French and Dutch between their colonies in the New World. But even the Protestant Dutch couldn't handle such mistreatment of a priest at the hands of natives.
Father Jogues was taken to Manhattan Island, becoming the first priest to visit Manhattan Island, incidentally, and was nursed back to health before being put on a ship to return to France.
Naturally, he was hardly recognizable when he returned to his confreres in France. He remained there for 2.5 years. Pope Urban VIII was said to consider Jogues a living martyr, and granted Jogues special dispensation to celebrate Mass despite his mutilated hands.
Yeah, at the time, canon law stipulated that only the index finger and thumb could touch the host, no others. Jogues was missing a thumb, and at least one index finger had been gnawed off, so he simply, he couldn't follow the law. But he had a pretty good reason.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah, so the Pope readily granted him a dispensation.
Yeah, good call. All in all, Jogues told his fellow Jesuits that he considered his imprisonment with the Mohawk to be a blessed time and an opportunity. He had an unparalleled opportunity to come to know their customs and their language, and he spoke lovingly of them. While with them, he had surreptitiously evangelized many and even quietly baptized a few. He was eager to return to New France to serve as an ambassador to the Mohawk people. Finally, he was allowed to return. When he sailed, he was joined by the third of our North American martyrs, John de Lalande.
John de Lalande was 19 years old when he and Jogues arrived in New France in spring of 1646. Like Goupil before him, he was a donné, a layman who was giving himself to be a helper to the Jesuits in their missionary work. He had been inspired by Jogues' testimony and desired to serve where he could.
The situation in the New World had changed a bit since Jogues left. The Huron and Iroquois weren't buddy-buddy by any means, but they had begun actually trading prisoners rather than just torturing and butchering them in, really cruel ways. In 1645, the French, Huron, Algonquin, Iroquois, and Mohawk signed a treaty. All sides agreed to simply allow safe passage through their territory to aid trade and travel. They hadn't set aside their differences completely, but they recognized that constant violence wasn't in anyone's interests. Jogues' desire was to be one of those who maintained that peace and helped it develop into something more significant. To this end, in the middle of 1646, he returned to Ossernenon, the Mohawk village where he had been tortured and Goupil martyred. This time he went as an envoy of the government of New France. After his diplomatic mission to Ossernenon, he returned to Quebec City.
But shortly after, he went back to Ossernenon, and this time as a missionary. Concerning this missionary trip, he wrote to his superior, "My heart tells me that if I am the one to be sent on this mission, I shall go, but I shall not return. But I would be glad if our Lord wished to complete the sacrifice where he began it. Farewell, dear Father. Pray that God unite me to himself inseparably." He was not seeking martyrdom, but his desire to bring Christ to those Mohawk who had persecuted him so harshly made martyrdom kind of a fact of life.
Yeah, really. Of his own sufferings and those of others he had witnessed, he had written, "The procession of torture victims beginning to enter this narrow way of paradise, it was indeed then that I could say with my Lord and Master, Supra dorsum meum fabricaverunt peccatores. Sinners have built and left monuments and marks of their rage upon my back."
John de Lalande was committed to accompanying Father Jogues on this missionary trip, as he had done on the diplomatic trip. Before departing, Jogues made it quite clear to de Lalande that he expected to be martyred. He told de Lalande that if he had any fears or hesitations about the likelihood of martyrdom, then he should remain behind. With his eyes open and with full heart and full mind, de Lalande accepted these terms and went with the missionary to the Mohawk.
When Jogues and de Lalande arrived in the Mohawk camp, they were received tentatively. The elders accepted their presence and did not particularly mind their effort to evangelize. But the younger braves were less enthused. That hadn't really changed. They disliked the peace treaty, and they saw Jogues as a living witness to it. Further, there had been a drought that summer and another outbreak of smallpox. They blamed both on Jogues, and in particular on his mass kit.
Jogues and de Lalande were staying in the longhouse of his aunt, the older Mohawk woman who had protected him and whom he served during his captivity.
On October 18th, a young brave came to Aunt's home and invited Jogues to a council of sorts in the brave's own longhouse. Jogues knew well that it could be a trap, but his mission made it impossible to refuse the invitation. When he entered the longhouse, he was immediately tomahawked and beheaded.
John de Lalande was still safe in Auntie's house and was told basically that he had to remain there for his own safety. He could not, however, let his master's body remain unburied and without proper reverence. He went out to collect the body of Father Jogues. He was caught and suffered the same fate. Both Jogues and de Lalande's heads were put on pikes on the village wall and their bodies thrown into the river.
In an interesting twist of grace, the following year, 1647, natives who were allies of the French captured the Mohawk brave who was known to be responsible for Jogues' death. He was tried and sentenced to death, but the night before his execution he requested baptism and took the name Father Isaac Jogues. The martyrdom of Jogues and de Lalande would be followed in the following 2 years, 1648 and 1649, by the martyrdoms of Antoine Daniel, Jean de Brebeuf, Noël Chabanel, Charles Garnier, and Gabriel Lalemant, the other 5 North American martyrs. But they were all martyred in Canada, so, we'll let the Canadian Catholic History podcast cover them, if it exists. So, anyway.
These 8 men were canonized together by Pope Pius XI in 1930 as St. John de Brebeuf, St. Isaac Jogues, and companions, martyrs. Today they have 2 major shrines. One is near the site of St. Joseph in modern-day Midland, Ontario. The other is near the site of Ossernenon, just outside of present-day Auriesville, New York.
Now, I've not been to Auriesville, but I know that you have, and the way you talk about it makes me want to change that. So we should make a point to get there.
It is an incredibly peaceful place. When you go down from the parking lot across the grounds and over to where the village was, there's just a sense that something happened there. There's a peace, a presence to that space. The sacrifices of Rene Goupil, Isaac Jogues, and John de Lalande happened about 380 years ago, but the place where they offered themselves for Christ remains blessed, as we pray the entire continent may remain. This has been American Catholic History. If you enjoy American Catholic History, please become a supporter. We've got great perks for supporters. Get information on how to become a supporter and the perks at americancatholichistory.org/support.
Also, on our website, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about the North American Martyrs or the Canadian Martyrs, whatever your preference is, see about our pilgrimages, and find other great stories from American Catholic history.
And also check out our merch.
And merch.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. Those and the 5-star ratings help others find us. You can email us feedback, questions, tips for episode topics, or other comments at feedback@americancatholichistory.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/American Catholic History, on Instagram at ACH_podcast, and follow us on Twitter at ACH1513. I'm Noelle Huster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Thank you once again for joining us on American Catholic History, made possible by listeners like you.